All right, let's dive right into this. Imagine, for a second, a single kind of drab Art Deco office block in Midtown Manhattan just quietly controlling the airwaves of an entire generation. I mean, it's a fascinating mystery, right? How exactly did one building become the absolute epicenter of a billion-dollar pop music empire and then, seemingly overnight, find its entire business model totally obsolete? Well, welcome to this explainer on the Brill Building. Today, we're going to explore the rise of the ultimate hit-making factory, the creative geniuses who worked inside its walls, and most importantly, we'll dig into exactly why this unstoppable machine suddenly ground to a halt. Think about your absolute favorite stuck-in-your-head songs from the 1950s and 60s. We're talking tracks by iconic artists like the Shirelles, the Drifters, or even those early rhythm and blues hits by Elvis Presley like Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock. Now, here is the crazy secret about all that. The performers you see on those iconic album covers, they rarely actually wrote those legendary tunes. Instead, those songs were the product of a hidden mastermind, a fiercely competitive hive of songwriters, all operating out of one very specific Manhattan address. Section 1, the Pop Music Factory, 1619 Broadway, New York City. So originally built in the early 1930s, this building basically picked up the mantle from the famous Tin Pan Alley. By 1962, it had become this massive, vertically integrated music ecosystem. We're talking about a space housing around 165 different music businesses, all under one roof. It wasn't just writers. Publishers, record labels, voice coaches, talent agents, recording studios, the whole shebang. They totally perfected this highly competitive assembly line pop model. Here's how it worked. A young songwriter would clock in and head to a tiny, claustrophobic little room, they actually called them cubbyholes, equipped with literally nothing more than an upright piano, a stool, and a chair for their lyricist partner. They'd bash out a melody, pair it with lyrics, and then immediately step out to pitch it to a publisher right down the hall. If the publisher liked it, boom, they'd take it downstairs to a recording studio, cut a demo, and they could even pitch it to radio promoters who were right there in the building. It was, honestly, industrial efficiency applied directly to creative art. Section 2, defining the Brill's sound, sophisticated teen pop. The executives running the show at the Brill Building had a brilliant formula. They recognized a powerful, rising subculture, teenagers. So they took the raw, rebellious energy of early rock and roll and made it highly palatable. They gave the music tight structures, relatable teenage themes about romance and tragedy, and even layered in sweeping orchestral arrangements. It was catchy, polished, and commercially irresistible. Just look at this roster of immense talent. The sheer density of musical genius working under one roof is absolutely staggering. You had Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller writing for Elvis, Jerry Goffin and Carole King churning out hits like Will You Love Me Tomorrow, Burt Bacharach and Hal David crafting intricate pop masterpieces, and Neil Sedaka with Howie Greenfield. What's truly wild is that these writers were incredibly young themselves. Many were just in their late teens or early 20s, barely older than the actual teenagers they were writing for. This gave their music an incredibly authentic emotional connection to the youth market. And the crucial takeaway here is that this music didn't just sell records, it changed culture. The writers at the Brill Building were heavily influenced by the melting pot of New York City itself. They were blending Latin rhythms, traditional black gospel, and rhythm and blues. Plus, this era boosted incredible female songwriters who proved without a doubt they were just as capable in the studio as their male counterparts. And significantly, these mostly white writers were penning massive hits for black female artists and groups like the Shirelles, the Ronettes, and the Crystals. This unique hybrid sound found massive crossover success on both the pop and R&B charts, literally helping to actively integrate popular music from mainstream America. Section 3, the singer-songwriter disruption, the 1964 turning point. So for years, this Brill hit-making machine seemed completely unstoppable. It was a perfectly oiled factory. But then, a massive cultural shift occurred that sent shockwaves through 1619 Broadway, threatening the very core of their entire business model. Which begs the question, how does a billion-dollar, highly efficient music empire suddenly become obsolete in the mid-1960s? Why did this style have to change so rapidly? To understand this, we have to look outside the walls of the factory and see what the artists themselves were starting to do. Listen to how Bob Dylan aggressively and famously put it, "Tin Pan Alley is gone. I put an end to it. People can record their own songs now." See, the traditional model was built on a really strict division of labor. Writers wrote and singers sang. Simple. But artists like Dylan were proving that you absolutely didn't need a professional songwriter in a New York cubbyhole to give you a voice. You could write your own deeply personal, authentic material. And just like that, the era of the anonymous writer for hire was suddenly under heavy fire. It really came down to a clash of two models. You had the traditional Brill Building model relying on that strict assembly line production, keeping writers and performers totally separate. But then came the British invasion model. When the Beatles crossed the Atlantic in 1964, they completely rewrote the rulebook. Artists were suddenly self-contained. John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote their own songs, and the music was witty, original, and incredibly sophisticated. Because of this monumental success, record executives' expectations fundamentally changed. Suddenly, it was just anticipated that a true artist should write their own material. Section 4. Audiences grow up, shifting demographics. And, it wasn't just the artists who were changing. The audiences were changing right along with them. The teenagers who had originally bought into the innocent bubblegum pop of the late 50s and early 60s, well, they were growing older. As they matured through a pretty turbulent decade, they started demanding music with much more lyrical depth, political awareness, and real substance. The simple teenage romance formulas that worked perfectly in 1961 simply weren't resonating the same way by the late 1960s. Section 5. From Writers to Stars, the Evolution of the Factory. Now, the decline of the assembly line genre didn't mean the talent in the Brill Building just faded away. Far from it. Actually, it triumphantly evolved. As the demand for manufactured teen pop started dropping, the writers realized they didn't need to hand their best songs over to someone else. They stepped right out of those cubbyholes, sat behind the microphone, and became the stars themselves. Let's trace how fast this happened. In 1959, the tragic death of Buddy Holly creates a vacuum in rock and roll, which the Brill Building eagerly fills by manufacturing teen idols. By 1960, they're dominating the charts with groups like the Shirelles. But then, 1964 hits, the Beatles arrive and bring that self-contained singer-songwriter model to the masses. This major disruption forces an evolution that culminates in 1971, when former Brill Building cubbyhole writer Carole King releases her solo masterpiece, Tapestry. 10 million. That is an insane number. That is how many copies Carole King's Tapestry sold, on top of winning 4 Grammy Awards. She took songs she had previously written for others, like Will You Love Me Tomorrow, and she recorded them with her own raw, authentic voice. Selling 10 million records proved once and for all that the songwriter could be the ultimate solo star. The factory model had officially closed, sure, but the brilliant minds it forged went on to completely define the singer-songwriter era of the 1970s. Which brings us to our final thought. The original factory at 1619 Broadway might be mostly empty of pianos today, but the system it created, it never truly died. If you look at modern pop music, the way tracks are created from massive stars like Katy Perry or Ariana Grande, you see teams of specialized writers, producers, and top-liners collaborating in an almost identical, highly structured way. So I leave you with this question. Next time you turn on the radio, listen really closely. How many of today's hits are secretly just echoes of the Brill Building assembly line? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep listening for the history hiding in your favorite songs.